Right, hello, my name is Aaron Octavia Rodriguez, and today I'll be giving a short summary on price volatility, supply shocks, and the role of buffer stocks in protecting international trade. Right, so I just want to start with explaining a little bit of what supply chains look like in the 21st century, so that we can keep this in mind as we progress in the video. So it's important to note that what characterizes supply chains in the 21st century is the complexity of the network. Supply chains now tend to span across continents, and a supply shock in one part of the world can have ripple effect on supply chains everywhere else. Right, so these supply shocks, if great in magnitude or sustained for a long period of time, can lead to what we call a cost of living crisis. And that's characterized by high prices of products, which leads to reduction in consumption because people don't have money to spend. And that leads essentially to a shrinking economy, um, which often sees reduced levels of international trade, which is something that we want to maintain at high levels. Right, so let's have a look at supply and demand because I think that will answer a lot of our questions about cost of living prices, why prices go up. And yeah, so here we've got one of the most important graphs in all of economics, and it's that of supply and demand. Right, so on the y-axis we have price, and on the x-axis we have quantity of a product. Right, and as well as that, we have two different lines on the graph. We've got the line of demand, which I find helpful to think represents the behavior of the consumer, and that of supply, which represents that behavior of the producer. Right, so what we can see here is that if we look at the supply line, we make sense of this going up because as the price of a product increases for a producer, they are going to want to create more of that product so that they can get more money. So, in the case of the supply line, if you increase the price, the quantity that is produced, if it's feasible, will also increase. And the demand is very different because people, what they want is not to have to spend much money, and yeah, when quantity is low, the price usually goes up because the demand is really high because there's not enough for everybody. And it decreases as the quantity of product increases. So we find equilibrium price, which is seen in the cross section of both lines, and that is what dictates our price of a product usually. Right. Now we're going to have a look at supply shocks and how they affect price now that we've understood a little bit about how price works. So, in this graph, we have the same as before, but this time we have two supply lines. We've got supply line one, which is the normal supply line. So, if productivity is normal and you've created as many products as you usually do, you'll have that supply line one. But if you have a shock to that supply line, a negative one, then you will decrease your productivity and you will shift up to supply line two, where you can see that the output is lower. And what happens to the price, as you can tell, is that you go from E1, which is your equilibrium price one, and it shifts up the y axis to E2. And that explains why prices go up, because when you have less product, the supply line shifts up and you'll have a higher price for the product. Now that we've briefly looked at supply and demand and what a supply shock is in terms of price, I'm going to introduce the concept of a buffer stock. Now, it's a really simple, quite neat risk management measure in international trade. And essentially, they're stockpiles of commodities, in other words, products, that are saved in case production hits a low or in case, for example, transport costs are too high. And the aim of creating buffer stocks is to reduce the impact of that price volatility. So, what we just saw, that movement from E1 to E2. So, in other words, they just try to keep prices low. And we're going to have a look at how that works now. Right, so how do buffer stocks actually work? Well, it's a very simple premise. And here we've got yet another graph similar to the ones before. We've got our price on the Y, our quantity of a product on the X, and we've got our two supply lines and a demand line. So if we look at supply line number one, S1, and intersect with D, we have our target price. So if everything's normal, we'll have our target price. Now, if supply falls to S2, the line above S1, then what happens is we see that shift in price as we did before from E1 to E2, or in this case, TP to P2. Right, buffer stocks, what they do is they input a certain amount of quantity of product in order to be able to shift that line down, the S2 back to S1. So if we look at the x-axis quickly, we can see there's a Q2 and a Q1. So essentially, buffer stocks make up that difference between Q2 and Q1 in order to push that price from P2 down to our target price. It's pretty neat. So it basically works in by injecting commodities into the system. Right, so now I think it's important to place what we've learned into the context of climate change because, according to the IPCC, we can expect more frequent extreme weather events, or in economic terms, we can expect more climate related supply shocks. So, employing methods such as buffer stocks might be advantageous to protecting international trade. So essentially, climate change is going to lead to a more volatile market and could negatively impact trade if reasonable measures are not taken, such as, for example, buffer stocks or a diversification of imports. So I think it's just important to take this into account and relate a little bit more production to consumption. Well, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope it's been a useful introduction into supply and demand, buffer stocks, and supply shocks. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate to pop one in the comments. And Didi Madlova for listening.